everybody wants to understand others and ourselves, including this kingpin question, I believe. What is human nature, or what is the heart of man? Now, for instance, years and years ago, I ran across a book by Erich Fromm, other than the one he had written that he is perhaps most famous for, The Art of Loving. This other book is entitled The Heart of Man, I believe. Additionally, Freud wrote about war and why mankind might want to be involved in war and was involved in war. When it comes to Christian beliefs and Christian scriptures, there's the strong concept of mankind as a fallen creature, a sinful creature, and that all have fallen short of the glory of God. It labels thus in Christian scriptures all of us as sinners. But what does that mean then? Does that mean we are all pretty much equal sinners? Does that mean also, in terms of Fromm's book, The Heart of Man, that we all have one single type of heart? For while the biblical scriptures in the Christian tradition or religion talk on the one hand of all being sinners, yet at other points talk of certain men as having distinguished themselves as being quite righteous. There was the man pointed out, for instance, Job, another man Noah, yet another man Esau. And in a video by a man named Tozer, a Christian writer in the past, trying to remember, perhaps 50 years ago, 30 years ago, he had written on this kind of a topic and done an audio or video entitled The Spiritual Man Walks Alone. I suppose then, in terms of the person's morals, character, empathy level, these words alluding to something rather unusual. He didn't use, for instance, the word and phrase, the religious man walks alone, as opposed to the non-religious man, or the Christian walks alone versus the non-Christian man, or the Christian man walks alone versus the so-called atheist. He stated a very select or unusually low number of people ordinarily termed religious. He recategorized as spiritual and said they walk alone. And then he talked at some short length about people, again in biblical scriptures such as Noah and Esau, as also walking alone. Of course, the Christian scriptures are also replete with making a distinction between the Pharisees versus Jesus and other strong followers of the message there. And if I didn't allude to it already, Christian scriptures also urge us to winnow the wheat from the chaff, or to distinguish good from evil. Now you look in the history and examples even today of animals, human beings, yes, an animal also, but we consider ourselves king of the apes, or the most evolved, or gifted with consciousness, and so on. Some would say a soul also. You might put on one end of the spectrum lower form animals, i.e. not human, of today's era, as the so-called gentle animals versus the very aggressive or vigorous animals. I think even in terms of dogs then, the golden retriever versus the Rottweiler or Doberman Pinscher. And when it comes not just to the amount of teeth bared, so to speak, but ingesting food for sustenance, I see again a strong bifurcation. We find it mentioned in biology or whatnot, zoology, that you have your carnivores and you have your herbivores. And then there are some animals whom are called omnivores, eating both. Interestingly too, amongst the carnivores, sometimes the higher level carnivore, if I were to call such that, eats quite a number of lower order carnivores, or rather animals, as part of the carnivore process. For instance, a shark may consume quite a number of small fish. And I have no idea, but maybe a wolf consumes quite a number of other animals. And mankind too, consuming oftentimes in a variety of countries a number of, quote, lower form animals. Now, I believe it is National Geographic that has put out several special purpose magazines, one of them Predators and another Pirates. And we do have the term hunter, as applies to mankind going off in the woods, say, to hunt animals, rather than talking about hunting in terms of, say, plant substances. Although I would state, I met a man a month ago at a festival devoted to hunting mushrooms, and he stated the going price today per pound for a special morel mushroom is $100 per pound. So you can say hunting on the human level, or as done by humans, can be, again, the hunting of animals or plants, in this term, mushrooms. We can even hunt for gold, say, hence the gold rush, period. Now, sometimes the term predator is supposed to mean, I suppose, a vicious creature or something rather unusual. And yet, as I alluded to concerning hunting, we can hunt a number of things. We can hunt animals, we can hunt plants. Yes, like the mushroom, we can hunt gold. We can go treasure hunting, so to speak, with a metal detector in general and hunt for coins. We can even, quote-unquote, pursue dreams, or hunt dreams, if you wanted to say. Now, perhaps we should say we can be predators also of such things, a wide variety of things. We can hunt or be predators for food, whether meat, plant, or both. We can hunt or be predators for water, especially if in nature, like on a walk or camping or in the desert. We can hunt or be predators for a good night's sleep, especially without sleeping pills. We can hunt even for clean air. Or if you have a COPD, say from smoking or some other malady, you may hunt to have enough capacity to breathe properly to survive, without wheezing, by the way. In this case, then, instead of hunting with a rifle for meat, a person might hunt for air or be a predator for air with oxygen tanks and oxygen masks. And even hire people to help you hunt for air at a most economical and efficient manner. So I believe there isn't a single animal and human being ever in the planet's existence who doesn't hunt and be a predator for something or another. What it most craves, what it seems to need, or does need, either genetically or by way of its emotions, especially, I would maintain, as per how the animal was brought up or programmed, shall you say. For instance, a dog treated meanly will have a different set of desires, shall we say, goals or predator orientations or hunting orientations than the same animal otherwise that was treated decently. Hence the concept animal cruelty can turn a dog vicious. And the vicious dog then being a predator of something it wasn't a predator of before. It has different goals, different cravings now. Getting on to humans now, various sources have said the human being is the only animal that can be so cruel. Perhaps that's because, in part, the human being is the only animal so skilled in rationalizing the effects of what it does or might want to do, given certain conditions. So we talk about humans sometimes desiring to go hunting, to be predators of other animals other than humans, and yet there's an interesting movie, for instance, in which humans are hunting other humans. The movie Hard Target, which came out in 1993, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, featured businessmen, two of them in particular, who offered what you might call hunting expeditions in which so-called homeless people had the option or opportunity to garner $10,000 if they could make it across town without being killed, basically, by human hunters, period. The movie overall didn't get high marks, received a lot of criticism, yet had a almost cult following, it is said, on at least one source on this movie. Perhaps it struck a little bit to the quick. We love to think that mankind would never want to hunt other humans, or that we would only do so in self-defense of ourselves, our family, our communities, our country, and then patriotism invoked. So once again, I believe we all have goals, all animal forms, and thus are predators for those goals. We are hunters for those goals, what it is we most crave. Now, the more trivial, ephemeral, come-and-go goals, I wouldn't call things that are kingpin goals that we would then say we're being predators of. Naturally, all animals need a certain caloric intake, and then there are other matters also. Again, some animals being predators of other animals, others predators of plants, and some predators of both, depending. Mankind stated finding it very, very offensive to be a predator of other human beings for meat. There being a few instances in which humans consumed other humans when absolutely necessary, for instance during an airline crash, perhaps in the Andes, or a few other instances. Maybe also cannibalism to some extent, I'm not sure. But if we're not, as human beings, generally desirous of eating other human beings for meat and caloric substance, are there human beings who differ from others in terms generally not of seeking to eat other human beings literally, but to eat something else, to crave to have something else from some other human beings? That might be to be predators of other human beings' happiness. And I believe especially writers and sages throughout religious history have talked of various terminology to differentiate people as human beings who hunt down and try to destroy or impinge upon the happiness of some others. I would say particularly those not their allies. There being some kind of a balance here. If you hunt down the happiness and try to destroy the happiness of all people to a significant degree or totally, you have no one left as an ally or information source. No backup. You've thus killed the goose that lays the golden eggs for you completely. So we've heard the phrase such as, somebody has a very good heart. Or perhaps in Star Wars movies, there being a talk of the fight between good and evil. I'm not sure if in this series it is referred to as the light and the dark. Or I forget the words, I would have to look. But there being a differentiation. Also sometimes the words good versus evils, good versus evil, or the righteous versus the unrighteous. I'll close, perhaps, with a comment here, a small list, and this is not a trivial thing, of what might come under lowering a person's happiness level or destroying it completely. These are kind of like subcomponents I've jotted down here after much thought and reading through the years, and observation, of course. A person's happiness, other than our own, can be impinged upon, lowered, destroyed, temporarily or permanently, by, for instance, injuring someone else's hope level. Hope being very important. Those, in fact, who call suicide hotlines are said, almost without exception, to be without hope. Hope, I would say, of pulling out of their pain points, at least on a temporary or varying basis, I'd say. Hope of growth, hope of getting unstuck, oneself or for one's loved ones. Then there's the very strong matter of self-esteem, of self-worth, of feeling of worthiness to somebody at least. I'm reminded, even for what it's worth, one way or another, the movie The Horse Whisperer. At one point, the character named Tom Booker, played by Robert Redford, was asked by the younger gal who had lost part of her leg whether there was anything he was afraid of, and his response was he was afraid of becoming or being useless. Might this then be the feeling one would have if one has very low or no self-esteem, in particular because it had been hunted down and partially or completely destroyed by somebody else? I think, too, a predator of someone else's happiness can make a great inroad in lowering the happiness levels of some others by consuming some other's time. You might also say, in general, freedoms. Some refer to this as our rights. Although I don't believe personally we have rights, but this is sort of a word alluding to constraints that some have and some don't, and the seeking to get an equal parity. I think, too, one can impinge negatively, greatly harm the happiness level, temporarily or permanently, even destroy it, by negatively impacting the mental faculties of someone else. Tom Brady, for instance, an assistant to President Reagan, once incurred a gunshot to the head, and his mental faculties as well as some physical functioning were impaired. And in fact, it was declared upon his death, Tom Brady's that is, in his 70s, that the coroner's report was that he died of a homicide. You might say declared homicide because of a lowering of his happiness level, despite living to his 70s. Hence, with Tom Brady, the lowering of his happiness level was declared upon his death by a judge or coroner, one of the two, to have been a homicidal action. Murder of his happiness level. His happiness level was sufficiently reduced that it was deemed a murder. His happiness thus was murdered, or killed off, reduced severely. Additionally, I believe this can happen not just from a bullet to the head, or traumatic car accident, say, or fall, but it can come from ingesting chemical substances, shall we say, that greatly negatively impact one's brain functioning, very similar in style to surgical operations with a knife or ice pick lobotomy, or again, as per a bullet to the head like happened to Tom Brady. All, in my mind, rather the same. The brain has been significantly negatively impacted, and this reduces not just physical functioning, but mental functions, and in turn reducing happiness levels severely. Two last things then, I believe, maybe three, that can impinge upon someone else's happiness level massively, and some desiring this, I believe, as a hunting or predatory action. The reduction of someone's reputation, this typically called libel and slander, or the reduction of the pursuit of their goals, referred to in part, for instance, by the declaration in some document that we have the so-called right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, the pursuit of happiness typically being pursuit in terms of our goals, as long as they don't negatively impact others or too severely our environment. And finally, happiness levels reduced markedly, some would argue, if your lifespan is suddenly cut short, or if you incur a disease or infirmity of some nature at the hand of someone else. Now, there are various speculations for how this can happen, that some would want to be predators, literally, of another human's body, but more aptly and commonly of another person's happiness level. This sometimes, I believe, termed a sociopath or psychopath. There being a lot of discussion, perhaps, of doing it for money, or for a sexual partner, or security, but I rarely see it being discussed in terms of garnering the pleasure of seeing someone else's happiness markedly reduced, and the more the merrier in terms of numbers and length of time. Those desiring to do so, I think, falling under the rubric then of the phrase, the right hand doesn't know what the left is doing. And there is a man, Trivers, Dr. Trivers, who writes about this in one of his books, The Folly of Fools. Perhaps this is somewhat what Jesus was referring to also when he uttered the words, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do," perhaps on a conscious level. And isn't that thus what the words, the right hand doesn't know what the left is doing, right hand executing some action, or rather the left hand executing some action, and the right not knowing the consequences to others. And Trivers and some others have talked of how this can happen, this almost kind of a split brain. There are, though, those in history who have talked on their deathbed of how they had regrets and how they had it all wrong. I don't want to point any specific examples, but there are people in history who were quite well regarded, but on their deathbed said they had many regrets, they take back what they said, and so on. So my thoughts then are that what we're talking about here is the predatory activity by some human beings to quash or reduce or eliminate the happiness of some others, as long as they have certain allies still. But this going greatly against the grain of the morals of a society, at least on the legal books, and sometimes in their own mind too. And so a variety of means evolved such that the actions are either blame-shifted or otherwise blocked off as to the effects on others in one's own mind. Hence again the phrase, the right hand doesn't know what the left is doing. Or the aware part of the mind doesn't know the impact that ordinarily one would know. It's somehow blocked off. Now, there are those who speculate this could be biological. They refer, for instance, to abnormalities in brains of mass murderers, depending on how you define a mass murderer. And yet, very few discuss how one's childhood impacts this. There is some evidence, or more, that Adolf Hitler, for instance, had a very vicious childhood. This might have made him a predator of human beings other than those who were German, and of certain Germans only. Hitler then could have been described, or today still described, as a predator of human happiness. Same going for some others, Stalin, Pol Pot, and so on. Every so often such an ogre, so to speak, pops up and rallies certain other miniature happiness predators in comparison in one group to coordinated action, as how I would put it. There are a few who have illuminated the way, I think, that a lack of good enough love in childhood can be a red flag for this to happen. I would at some future point perhaps mention some of the names that I've heard talk of this. But at any rate, I would mention that the psychologist Erickson had brought up the concept and bifurcation or demarcation between those good enough loved versus those not good enough loved. Now, granted, you can't make a direct, concise split like with a surgical knife, but I think the concept is very valid and impactful upon whom becomes the so-called human predator of happiness versus who doesn't. Who is the uplifter, the desiring to see others' happiness in general, versus those who wish to see others go down the tubes in terms of happiness, except for their own allies. This doesn't speak so well of human beings, of course, but then again, mankind is laden with, some say, a triune brain that is quite complex and module upon module built upon it, and given to extraordinary capacities for linguistic deception as well as nonverbal deceptions. Is it any mystery, then, we find our fellow man and ourselves so complex? My thoughts, then, on predators, hunters, and the concept of good and evil